Let's get some analysis now. I'm joined by Richie Merzian, Director of Climate at the Australia Institute. Richie, thanks for your time. This week there's been a lot of momentum building while the Prime Minister's in the United States towards action on climate, in Joe Biden committing $11 billion in terms of climate finance. What does that do in terms of momentum towards the COP?
It's significant because climate finance is the glue that brings a deal together at a COP. Developed countries committed to help mobilize $100 billion per annum by 2020 for developing countries to take more climate action. And so the US doubling its climate finance is a goodwill gesture and will hopefully encourage others, particularly China, the world's largest emitter, to do more as well. And already we've seen China come forward with more on the table in terms of what it could possibly do to help address rising global emissions.
Well, one of the things that China has done in this last week as well, in relation to financing coal-fired power plants, is that right?
That's right. So one of the very few things that China announced that was new is that it would stop financing overseas coal power stations. Now, this is important because they are one of the largest financiers of coal power stations globally. And given that Japan and Korea, the two other major financiers, have already announced that they will stop financing them, it basically means that the majority of support to build new coal power stations have now been turned off, because so have the multilateral development banks stopped this financing. This is important given Australia is arguably the largest supplier of coal in the world. You're now seeing a plateau in terms of coal demand. And if you implement these net zero pathways set out by China, Korea, and Japan, you're looking at a significant drop in coal demand globally. And the RBA recently put out a paper to show that this will have a serious impact for Australian coal exports, but not necessarily a serious impact on Australian economic benefits, basically, given that coal doesn't actually play a major role in our economy and in our global and in our national revenue. But it does play a large role in our exports.
The head of the International Energy Agency said overnight that, quote, "I'm impatient waiting for Australia to come up with a roadmap to zero emissions," unquote. This is obviously the latest comment, public and private, to the government, to the Prime Minister. Increasingly, it looks inevitable that that is where he is headed, including likely more ambitions in the medium term. Is that your sense of things?
It definitely seems to be the case. It's quite unusual to have the head of a major international forum like the International Energy Agency particularly call a country out like Australia. But I guess everyone is starting to become impatient with Australia, given it hasn't updated its efforts over 7 years now since it originally announced its target ahead of Paris, and nothing more has been put on the table. But net zero by 2050 is already becoming quite dated. It is no longer credible to only put forward a net zero by 2050 pathway. The US president has said that this coming decade is the decisive decade, and already all G7 countries have pretty much doubled their short-term climate targets. The US will cut its emissions by at least 50% by 2030. So a lot of effort will also be put on pushing Australia to do more in the short term, not just commit to a long-term pathway that could be unaccountable if it doesn't have clear interim targets along the way.
Climate Director at the Australia Institute, Richie Merzian, thank you very much. Appreciate your insights as always.